Hi everyone, and welcome to the online lecture for week 2 about the occupational therapy process, or the process of occupational therapy, and in particular we are focusing on the Canadian practice process framework. If you look in different textbooks, there are slightly different versions of the occupational therapy process, although you will see that they're quite similar. That there are similarities as well. We've chosen the Canadian one for the reasons I've already talked about in terms of how it fits together with some of the other frameworks and models and concepts that we have talked about, and others we will talk about. I just want to spend a bit of time at the beginning for you to, and encourage you to think about what we are talking about when we meet, when we talk about the occupational therapy process. Clearly, the clues are all there. First of all, it's got something to do with occupation, which is something you know quite a bit about already, and we'll continue to learn more about. The therapy bit is interesting and something we haven't really talked about in any great depth, but we'll start to much more this semester. And just as a very broad definition of what therapy is, it's about the intentional use of the relationship between people for the benefit of the client. Okay, and I think that's important. If you put it together with occupation, occupational therapy is about using occupation and the relationship that forms as part of that and through that for the benefit of the client. And clearly, a process is a process or a number of stages in which to do that, through which you can do those things. So the one we've chosen is the Canadian Practice Process Framework, which you have access to the book chapter about. And this is the thing that will become your friend over the next few years, in terms of helping us whenever we think about occupational therapy practice, and what we should be doing and how we should be doing. Just some of the general principles to start off with. The process framework, the CPPF, is a way of delivering evidence-based, client-centered, occupation-based occupational therapy. Okay. And you should recognise all of those things and a few others that aren't mentioned there, because they're all part of the program aim for the Bachelor of Occupational Therapy at Griffith University. So for that reason, but also because all of those things are crucial to contemporary occupational therapy, the CPPF very explicitly states it supports that, and so that's one of the reasons why we're going to focus on the CPPF. As I said, there are multiple occupational therapy processes, and they all include, and we covered this really briefly last semester, assessment, intervention, and evaluation very broadly. But also, it's interesting to note that other professions have processes that also include assessment, intervention, and evaluation. Okay. The distinct difference about this is what was on the previous slide. That this is a way of doing, particularly that last bit, occupation-based, and that's what makes this process and us implementing this process different from other professions. But you will see, if we wanted to simplify it, it has all of those things in there, but it's broken down to help guide us through the process a bit more. The other thing that is worth noting, and the book chapter talks about this, but is something again that's important for occupational therapy in the contemporary paradigm, but also for us in the Griffith program and thinking about the future, is the Canadian practice process framework is very much designed to be used with individuals, groups, and communities. Okay, so whenever it talks about client, a client could be an individual, a client could be a group, or a client could be a whole community. And so not to fall into the trap of thinking this is about working with individuals. The CPPF is very much about individuals, groups, and communities as well. So this is the CPPF, and it has the 8 stages. Some of the key things which the book chapter talks about is recognising that the shading in the smaller circles within the white part of the diagram are both blue and yellow, and that is to represent, on the left you can see there the client and therapist, because this approach to occupational therapy, and this is the client-centered part of it, recognises that what goes on between the therapist and the client is very much a collaboration, and so both of those people, or if the client's more than one person, all of the people involved are involved in all of these processes. And so it can challenge the power sharing that lots of health professionals have or are used to, but in a client-centered way, it's important for us to recognise that. The other thing to recognise is all the different lines, which look slightly confusing, but just recognise that the solid lines are sort of the standard route through this, but also recognising that the dotted lines are possibles as well. So, for example, we could we could do an assessment and evaluate somebody, do an evaluation, and recognise that there is nothing that we can offer or should offer, and so we might go directly to conclude or exit the process. And that might be that we refer on to somebody else, or that we suggest they come back after something else has happened, but there's nothing that occupational therapy can offer them at this point. Or we might go through the process, do assessment, evaluation, agree on objectives and a plan, and then conclude an exit for some reason. Again, it might be that we may not be the best person, or the client may change their mind at any point through this process, of course, and decide they don't wish to participate in occupational therapy. But otherwise, we'd continue through to implementation, monitor and modify. Then we would evaluate. And so we could evaluate the outcome at a certain point and recognise that we need to review, so go back up to agree on the objectives and the plans, and then continue down the left-hand side of the diagram. Or it might mean that we evaluate the outcome and then recognise and agree with the client that things are over and we've finished this particular occupational therapy intervention or contact. Now you've got one in the handout, the second page of the handout talks a bit more about each of those stages, and we will talk about each of those stages in a bit more detail. I just wanted to set the scene a bit more in terms of the process framework more broadly. So thinking about the societal context and practice context, and remember that in the book chapter it talks about, and we've talked about, how this practice process framework is very much consistent with, aligned with, congruent with the Canadian model of occupational performance and engagement. And so it's not surprising to see those words on the screen there. So that in this framework, when we're talking about societal context, we're talking about all of those different contexts: the cultural, institutional, physical, and social. And what it recognises is that the OT process happens within all of those contexts. So in the past, last semester, we talked about how occupation happens within contexts. This model recognises that that is the case, but furthermore, occupational therapy happens within all of these contexts. And so, just as these contexts influence occupation, they can, will, should influence occupational therapy practice. Okay, and we might have a think about how that can happen. So that one's fairly straightforward, the societal context. The practice context is slightly new, but is similar, and is broken into personal context and environmental context. And I guess to recognise that the personal includes the personal practice context of the therapist, as well as the personal practice context of the client. So both people, if we just stick to talking about two individuals at this point, both people come with particular experiences, knowledge, skills, hopes, fears, dreams, all those sorts of things, and they will have an influence on how the occupational therapy process is carried out. So, for example, and again, the book chapter has more detail and we will talk more about this, there are different aspects to the personal context or personal environment. So personal nature and temporal aspects includes the health, age, developmental, gender, race, ethnicity, and emotional state of health of the client and the therapist, and that they can influence the OT process. So thinking about in some countries, for example, where there are very clear roles for men and women to play, it may or may not be appropriate for a male therapist to work with a female client. And so that's part of the practice context, and it links into the societal context, but is something we might need to think about. Also, each individual brings their own knowledge, skills, and abilities, and so in some ways easy to think about in terms of the therapist. You have educational knowledge, experience. At the moment, you have very limited professional knowledge, experience as occupational therapist. You will bring other things with you. And a whole range of other things as well. And then there's your perspectives on past, present, and future. And so that's about the values, beliefs, your vision for what might be possible, and what might not be possible. And so both the client and the therapist bring all of those things to the occupational therapy process. Then environmental, they are the same, but thinking much more about how does that impact, how do those things impact at the level of the environment in which this OT practice is occurring. And so, for example, the physical, and again, it's in the book chapter. So physical is about what sort of facilities are available for you and to work in with the client. Social, are there other health professionals involved? Can you refer on? Do you have to deal with a lot of the issues? Cultural, what's the culture of that facility? What's the culture of our profession as occupational therapists? And institutional, are there facility policies and procedures, for example, that might dictate where therapy can happen and where it can't happen? And so all of those things influence the occupational therapy process, which is why they're framed on the outside. And so what we will do this week is think in a bit more detail about some of those external or those contextual issues, the societal and practice context as they're labelled here, and how they might do influence on the occupational therapy process as depicted in this diagram. We'll also start to think about, we'll think in a bit more detail about the different stages, and then over the next few weeks we're going to focus in on some of those stages in a bit more detail. So that's the Canadian practice, or that's a very brief overview, very deliberately, because it's just about getting the broad picture of the Canadian practice process framework.